Welcome to day 3 of the conference. And we are having a keynote session, and I'll leave Dr. Mogodi and Professor Franz Maposa to introduce the speaker. But may we acknowledge the conference funding organization, which is the German Academic Exchange Service, with funds from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation. With that being said, we are ready to kickstart our session for this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed the morning sessions. Dr. Mogodi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mashumba, and good afternoon, evening, morning to you all out there in the world. I am pleased to be co-hosting this session, this Keynote 4 session with my colleague, Professor Franz Maposa, who is a sociologist. He is our graduate coordinator and is actually one of our leaders in the department. I will tell you a little bit about Professor Gabriele Rosenthal. She is a German sociologist who is recognized internationally for introducing the method of biographical case reconstruction using biographical narrative interviews. She is also renowned in the field of general and interpretive sociology, biographical research, qualitative methods, ethnicity, migration, conflict studies, and intergenerational relations. Professor Rosenthal is a professor of qualitative methods and director of the Center of Methods in Social Sciences in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Göttingen in Germany. She served as president of the research committee RC38, Biography and Society of the International Sociological Association, from 2002 to 2010. She is currently a member of the board for DGS since 2019. With that introduction, I welcome Dr. Rosenthal to give us her presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this nice introduction. And also for the invitation to give this talk. The title of my talk is Fieldwork and Biographical Research in the Always Think About It so-called Global South, about benefits, opportunities, and challenges. When the organizers of this conference asked me if I could give a talk on biographical research in Africa, my first thought was that this would be a good chance to counter some of the common prejudice against biographical research in the so-called Global South, and this on the basis of my own empirical experience. I would like to say how grateful I am for this opportunity. I have conducted biographical narrative interviews, or in general biographical research, in the Middle East and in Africa for more than 30 years now. In Africa, this applies mainly to field studies I carried out in Ghana, but mainly in Uganda, along with short periods of fieldwork in Morocco. And my colleagues and I have been out carrying out interviews for several years now with refugees and migrants who came to Western Europe, to Brazil, to Jordan and Uganda after leaving their homes in the MENA region, the Sahel zone and sub-Saharan Africa. Since the start of the pandemic, we conduct online follow-up interviews with these migrants and refugees and documented, and I must say I deliberately use this descriptive term of documented, their situation in times of COVID-19. My research is always based on biographical and figurational approach in the tradition of Berger and Luckmann and Norbert Elias. and is always embedded in fieldwork. So this means we are not doing only biographical interviews, it's combined with participant observation, with ethnographic interviews, with group discussion, family interviews, so-called expert interviews, and document analysis. And here I mean discourse analysis of different texts, including media text. I would like to emphasize here that especially when working in environments that we are not familiar with, and this means in Germany, in Europe or Africa, it is important to be flexible in accessing the field and to use different methods, regardless of which forms of access open up more easily than others. In other words, which kind of methods I use in which kind of order is always determined by how the field work progresses. Depending on the setting, we may begin with observation and group discussion, usually arising from chance conversation or ethnographic interviews with different people, and then go on to conduct biographical narrative interviews in a second step. By contrast, in a study I carried out with Arthur Bogner of so-called child soldiers in northern Uganda who had returned from the Lord's Resistance Army, the rebel army, we started by interviewing the returnees individually, and then it developed a relationship with them. They invited us on the compounds of their family, and we did there also family interviews and interviews also with their relatives. In almost all settings, I mean Arthur Bogner, my colleagues and myself, work with local field assistants who undertake the task of translating the interviews. So we mainly do the interviews in the local language. And with the field assistants, I must say they are not only interpreters, they are also colleagues, and we are discussing with them the interviews and our general observations. I come to the structure of my presentation. Now it's not working. What's going on? Oh, sorry. So first I will give you some remarks about biographical research that you have an idea how we are working. Then I will focus on the objections to this kind of research in the so-called Global South. And then I will also talk about possible challenges connected with interviews in the Global South, and I will concentrate on my research in Africa. And in the last part of my paper, I will embark on two empirical examples. First of all, the understanding and dealing in interviews with the theme of, or the issue of bad and good spirits, which was frequently invoked in Uganda to explain post-traumatic symptoms in returned child soldiers. And the second example is from interviews in northern in the northern region of Ghana. And it's referring to the issue giving away small children to other family, especially in chiefly clans. I come to the biographical research, the first part. First of all, I would like to give you an idea of our method of carrying out biographical narrative interviews. Here I have to say, besides expert interviews, thematic focused interviews, we are concentrating on life stories and the history of the family. And this means in these biographical narrative interviews, we are always asking for the whole life story. This applies whether I'm interested in the Christian and Muslim Palestinians in the West Bank and the figuration of relationship between these two religious groupings, or if I'm interested in former soldiers, child soldiers in northern Uganda and the process of their reintegration into civilian society after returning from the rebels, I'm always asking for the whole history. The methodological decision to ask interviews to tell their whole life story, and this independently from the research question we have, this is based on two fundamental assumptions. These assumptions, the first one is, in order to understand and explain social and psychological phenomena, we have to reconstruct their genesis, the process of their creation, reproduction, and transformation. For example, if you want to understand the reintegration process of returnees from the rebels in northern Uganda, I will need to consider the history of their life before the return from the bush, as they call it themselves. Wherever possible, this must be combined with a consideration of the collective history of the groupings to which the returnees belong and of the different discourses which were dominant in these groupings in different times. The second assumption is, in order to understand and explain actions, it is necessary to examine both the actor's subjective perspective and their course of action, as well as their experience in general. This means we want to find out what they experienced, what meaning they gave their actions or conduct at the respective time, what meaning they assign to them today, and which biographical constituted context of framing they place their experience in. This means it's a very important part of the kind of analysis I introduced, the case reconstruction, that we differentiate between the past perspective and the present perspective and try to reconstruct both. Thus, our aim is not only to find out what the ex-child soldiers, for example, think today about their time in the rebel army or about their life since their return, but as far as possible to reconstruct the actual events they experienced and in what order and how they interpreted those events at the time. And herefore, we are using the so-called narrative biographical interview. This I will skip, which was in the late 70s, introduced by a German sociologist, Fritz Schütze. And I think with this interview, we managed to come closer to the experience in the past. I have published a lot about it. Therefore, I will make it very short how we conduct a biographical interview. The main idea is that we first start with a very open question and let the people tell without intervening and being totally concentrated in the first phase of the interview on their relevant system and not on our own relevant system. This means I ask the interviewee, could you tell me your life story and maybe also your family history, or perhaps also I say in the history of your clan. I'm interested in your whole life and you can tell me everything what occurs to you. You have as much time as you like. Sometimes I also say we have also the possibility for a second interview and that I don't want to ask questions, that I only ask questions later. I only will take some notes. So we have first this main narration and in the questioning part, it's important that we differentiate between so-called internal narrative question and external. This means first, I ask only questions to topics the interviewee, him or herself, presented by him or herself, and only in the last part of the interview, I ask questions I think they are important. Though this, again, I have to stress, it's first a very strong orientation on the relevant system of the interviewee. I will come to the objections. In the course of my research, I have frequently been confronted with the criticism that the concept of biography is a social construct of the modern Western societies and can only be used to study social issues in such societies. And people have repeatedly told me very earnestly that in some parts of the world, such as sub-Saharan Africa, people are unwilling or unable to tell the story of their life. The most common explanation given for this is that the autobiography has no place in the so-called local traditions. It is true that autobiographies, and here I mean the published one, started appearing in a relatively late stage in the development of our society. One example is from Giacomo Casanova from Italy at the end of the 18th century. But Casanova does not relate his life story in the way that we would expect nowadays. His text is very static. He describes himself, for example, which kind of dresses he has, and there is no linearity. It's not a story of a development. Yet the differences between this text and autobiographies that were written decades or centuries later make it interesting for me as a sociologist. These differences help to throw light on the question of how people in different regions or different ages present themselves when they are asked to recount their life story or history of their family, and how the form of their presentation can be explained in terms of their experiences, their socialization, the dominant discourses to which they have been exposed, and the social circumstances in which they have lived. And of course, although the interview situation or the context where they are asked, the interaction between the one who is asking and the interviewee. If we assume that the concept of biography is a product of modernity and ask ourselves what this means for countries in the so-called global South, we need to think about how people there make sense of their lives, how they talk about themselves or about their V groups. I'm quite sure that all people seek to make sense of their lives, that asking who I am, what I'm doing here, or they ask, who are we? What are we doing here? And this is an anthropological constant. In other words, I'm starting from two assumptions. The first assumption is people and societies in which they live are not completely different. They do not function according to completely different psychological and social mechanisms. These are anthropological constants, as for example, Berger and Luckmann have argued. And this includes the question of the meaningfulness of our action, which is asked by individuals and by collectives. The second assumption I have, people and the society in which they live are different. The question of meaning, of how and why, is answered in different ways in different social contexts. The answers are a product of people's biographical experiences, which are always shaped by a particular context. And these experiences are not purely individual, but are embedded in the collective experiences of V groups and all those involved in the particular setting or milieu. The extent to which a life story, autobiography, or vita is subject to institutionally prescribed norms within a society, this is for me an empirical question. And I like very much that Nina said on the first day of the conferences, we should not have such a homogenizing idea about the so-called global North and the global South. It's always an empirical question in which setting, which institutions are developed, who ask for biographical narration, and what are the contexts they are told in. For example, we may think here of the Catholic practice of confession, which is one institution, especially in the beginning, that you are asked to tell about what you are doing, or talking about oneself in a job interview, or writing a CV. And this is always connected with specific norms. For example, when I started to learn how to write a CV, it was still clear that you have to write your religion and if you are married. Meanwhile, nobody is doing this in the academic area. In biographical research, the term biography generator is used to express this fact that there are specific institutions who are asking us to tell their life. A further assumption for which there is plenty, sorry, I skipped something. So we have the question, are there less biographical choices in the global, no, I missed something, sorry. Are there less biographical generators? I mean, less institutions in specific regions who ask to tell this life story. And the other thing, the main topic I'm interested, are there less biographical choices in the global South? Because in the moment when I have to decide to go to the right or to the left, these are situations which evoke biographical thematization, that we are thinking about ourselves, our past, and our future. I don't intend to discuss here the argument that there is a less differentiated division of work in non-modern society. In sociology, debates on this issue are mostly conducted in the global north. Nor will I discuss the assumption that the higher degree of individualization in modern society has led to a need for more biographical choices. This assumption was made, for instance, by Norbert Elias or Ulrich Beck. The important point for me is that this is always an empirical question. And in every case, we need to analyze the concrete regional context. To make my position clear, I do not share the assumption that in non-modern settings or ages or periods, individuals are faced with fewer biographical choices than in modern or postmodern society. Indeed, some choices in non-modern settings may be more consequential for the individuals concerned. For example, when a girl in an African country joined the Pentecostal in order to avoid a circumcision or a forced marriage, in contrast to Germany, when somebody, for example, decides to convert from Christianity to Judaism. We may ask whether there actually are any countries in which people need to make fewer far-reaching biographical choices, or in which there are no profound social transformation processes. And this always transformation in society invites or force us to think about our situation, our past, and the changing in the future. Even in very traditionalistic context, I mean this in the sense of Max Weber, there are always choices. If one take into account the many possibility unforced situations that can occur, such as violent conflict or natural disaster, it is clear that here two important biographical choices must be made. Questions like, should I stay in my village? Should I leave the village with my children or allow? Or is it more likely that I survive when I join the rebels and do not stay with the civilians? Or should I go to the government army? Or totally on another level, can I afford that my son goes to a school in town and leave the village? And at the present time, people all over the world are faced with unforeseen challenges because of the pandemic and having to make decisions which could have far-reaching consequences in their life. And such decisions will be thematized and reflected on in biographical self or representation. To state my point clearly, in my research, whether in Palestine, Jordan, Brazil, Ghana, or Uganda, I have never come across a grouping in which I was not able to conduct a biographical interview. It is an empirical question how people respond to the open question in the beginning of the interview. The important question is, what do we expect to hear when I ask somebody to tell his or her life story? Will it be an individual story or a story of a person or a clan or the ethnic or religious grouping or the local grouping, or will they present detailed political argumentation? And here I stress, I have no normative expectation in this regard. For me, everything is okay. Every answer is okay, and it's always an empirical question. And in the analysis, I want to find out why the question was answered in this way or another. The same applies to the question of how long the people are reacting. Some people will answer to the initial question with giving only some data in about 2 minutes and will wait for questions. while others embark on a long autobiographical narration, which may last several hours or even require subsequent meetings. This was, by the way, very often in the case of the returnees in northern Uganda, that they had a main narration after the first one for 7-8 hours in several meetings. So I have experienced both extremes. In Uganda, in Germany, independently, where we can find both. It is important to reconstruct the mechanism that determine the specific form of a biographical we or self presentation. This may be, for instance, religious discourses that prevent the persons concerned from telling their life story. This I could observe in the case of interviews with Catholic nuns in Germany. And also we have to take into account that in different regions, in different contexts, the we-I balance is different. There was, I think, also this reference on a talk on the first day of the conferences. I borrow these words from Norbert Elias. So if they are telling more about the we, or if they tell about them but are telling it in the we form, this is different to different regions, social settings and classes. And it's already a very interesting fact if in some groupings you get more the story of the clan and the individual life story is, let's say, shorter than this part. And this was, for example, very clear that in Ghana, in the minority so-called tribes, ethnic groupings, the telling about the ethnic grouping history was longer than in the so-called majority tribe. So this is the first very important empirical data to be interpreted. Another interesting question is whether it is usual to measure time by the calendar in the region or setting concerned. When Arthur Bogner and I conducted interviews with the former child soldiers from the Lord's Resistance Army, the first date mentioned in many cases was the date recorded on the amnesty card, which was given to them when they were returning from the bush by a humanitarian organization. In these groupings, reference to time tend to be full of contradiction, such as estimate how many years the person stayed with the rebels. In this case, it does not be enough or adequate to say that people in this region attach little importance to measuring time by the written calendar. This might be their first idea, it come up. But we also need to take into consideration that many traumatized ex-rebels have an altered sense of time, especially in respect of how long they stayed with the rebels. And this phenomenon of losing any sense of time, which is also observable after the return to civilian life, is thus not only a challenge in respect of analyzing the interviews, it's also an important fact. Also, this means that we not only be puzzled, how could I now explain this life story because there are so many introductions. The main question is, what does it mean that there are so many contradictions? Let me come back to the question whether this kind of research is possible in the global South. The answer to this question depends on our normative expectation in respect of a biographical presentation, as I already explained, but it also depends on our skill and competence in conducting an interview. It needs specific techniques and it needs frustration tolerance. So it's not working in the beginning. We try and see if it's getting more easily. And also it's important to establish a relationship of trust. My purpose here is to emphasize that the biographical narrative interview is an instrument that can be used in very different geographical contexts. It is especially suitable for the study of contexts that are unfamiliar to us, whether it is in Germany or it's in Botswana. The big advantage is you do not have to come with a guideline. You do not have to decide before your interviews which topics are important to ask, because you first are orientated on the interviewee himself or herself. And this method also works for building up a relationship of trust. This would be another paper to explain it. So allow me to give a very flappy reaction to the argument that one could not conduct biographical interviews in some regions of the global south. This idea is either connected that these people are unskilled in conducting this kind of interview, or they have rigid normative ideas of how a life story should be presented. As I already pointed out, this assessment has a lot to do with our expectations with regard to a biographical we and self-presentation, whether we are prepared to accept the way the person responds, or whether we only accept a response that corresponds to our fixed ideas of biographical narration. And here I have a lot of empirical examples that somebody starts, I mean, based on transcript, somebody starts, let's say, when I'm married, and then the interviewer interrupts and says, now please start with your childhood. This is connected with a normative expectation, how to tell the life story. This is what we are not doing. Whether it works straight away or not, whether it takes 4 hours or just a couple of minutes to get an answer, whether the answer is a long chain of arguments or a stream of narration, the manner in which the interviewee responds to my request to tell me the story of their lives gives me first important clues to the nature of the setting or the grouping I'm interested in. Thus, it's not surprising that former child soldiers who have returned from the rebel army, maybe you have an idea how they begin to tell their life story. In general, they begin with a very detailed account about the situation of their abduction. And they speak about the first days in the rebel army, because in these first days, they were forced to do very cruel murdering or to observe it. And they tell it in detail, and then they jump to the time when they escaped from the rebel army, even maybe 16 years between that they stayed for 16 years with the rebel, but we have a detailed narration about the first days and the abduction, and then they come to the escaping. I won't go into detail here, but I can say that Arthur Bogner and myself are agreed that this detailed narration from the beginning, with hypomnestic memories of certain very bad experiences at the beginning of a phase of an extreme traumatization, can be explained by the brutal invasion of this event into the everyday life of these young people, an event which ruptured their earlier lifetime and led to dramatic differences between the life before it happened and the life after it happened. This was discussed, for example, by William Niederland in the context of Holocaust studies. We believe that these narrations also have the function to demonstrating that they were powerless, to demonstrate I couldn't do anything. They abducted me and they forced me to kill. And that it was not their choice, as they often say. In such cases, the question is not whether it's a good interview, that I don't have the time in between. The important point is how this typical and frequently observed structure of the biographical presentation of ex-rebels can be explained. So to make it again clear, I mean, the way people are doing it is the question for the research to find out why are 16 years between in the bush are not told. And it's based on the analysis of the interviews and not of our interview ideas maybe, or categories we have in mind independently from the research. In the case of the former child soldiers, for example, it was clear that in the so-called external narrative part, a questioning part, they told us about their experiences in the bush, let's say in these 16 years. So it was not a taboo to speak about it. And this is already a first important data fact which we could interpret. I had to mention that we usually hold more than one interview appointment, which each individual usually combined with participant observation, inclusion of other people who are present during the interviews, and in some cases, a transition to family interview or group discussion, which people who are present from the beginning or would join us at some stage during the interviews. Whether in the refugee camps in the West Bank, or in family compounds in Acholi land in northern Uganda, my experience show that one must expect other family members or neighbors to come and show interest in the interview. A contrast comparison, for example, for an interview I did in the hotel with a returnee, and then I had a second interview with him or her on the compound of his family and clan, and other people are joining. This is interesting to compare in how far there are differences in the presentation. And then this means what are the rules for the discourses? What could you tell in the context of a family? For example, of course, you can expect it. They don't tell the killings they did in such detail, and not the concrete person they killed, maybe from the neighboring compound, when they were interviewed on the compound. So it gives us the comparison between different contexts, gives us insight in the rules of different dominant discourses. The challenging involving in eliciting biographical narration, conducting multiple interviews, and combining the findings from the interviews with data collected during observation or group discussion are the same as those which we were confronted when conducting biographical interviews with certain groupings in Western Europe. So to everything, I could also give you an example from interviews I did in Germany. It's not special for the so-called global South. In general, I do not see these challenges as being connected with the method of narrative interviews. Rather, especially when beginning field research in an unfamiliar culture, milieus, or geographical region, I have to cope with certain irritations or misunderstandings due to my ignorance of the local customs, or that I hesitate to ask certain questions because I fear the people might be offended or embarrassed. And yet this irritation can be an advantage. In the literature on methods, we find the suggestion that we should put ourselves in the position of a stranger when studying our own society or milieu. And this will happen without any effort when I do research in unfamiliar milieu. So it's a big advantage that we scholars from the global north find ourselves increasingly confronted with the discovering of phenomena that does not fit in our categories. And this is also the other way around, that scholars from the so-called global north or from other regions of the world are doing research in Western Europe or in Germany. They are discovering phenomena which are for us so self-evident that we are not thinking about it. For me, for example, doing research in several countries in Africa, this apply also in Palestine, I have to understand the different concept of family structures, of national borders, the concept of state or nation. So in general, I would say we have to avoid subsuming phenomena too quickly under familiar categories. And we always should have doubts that we understand what we hear or observe. And we should never be afraid to ask questions in interviews. And on this last point, I will elaborate in detail with an empirical example in the end of my talk. Sometimes our ignorance of the regional or local context can lead us to think that certain phenomena are individual or special features of the region, when in fact they are more widespread. For example, when I started working in Uganda, I had no idea how strong the belief in good and bad spirits is in certain region. I gradually learned how widespread it is, that it does not depend on the interviewee's educational background, and very important, I had to learn what function it can have. For example, in family members of ex-rebels sometimes claim that the returnees are possessed by bad spirit. And then they explain, because they are obsessed by bad spirits, they should not come back to the compound of the family. So the reason for arguing with bad spirits was in some cases to give them no land. And I mean that they cannot come back to the compound, and also that they are not able to participate in local decision-making processes. Here we also have to be aware that the we and self presentation might be influenced by a Western discourse. And this means with the result that sometimes they do not mention bad spirits. By the way, this was very obvious in Palestine, that the people know that we Westerners don't believe in such things. And so you have to ask about it. In general, we have to be aware that interviewers may not mention certain things because they know that the interviewer is a European, and be prepared to ask questions about these things just naturally as any topic. For example, I would ask, could you remember a situation in which you were troubled by bad spirits? And of course, I also have to take into account what is the impact of the field assistant who is also present, and maybe is not from the same ethnic grouping. Even if some of the returnees believe that their mental problems are caused by bad spirits, for us, they are clearly consequences of extreme traumatization. Yet I know scholars who doubt this and argue that traumatization is a Western concept. Extreme traumatization results from spending a long period exposed to constant death threats and not knowing whether or when this might come to an end. The consequences of this are not fundamentally different among other different groupings of people. They are all only interpreted differently. Many returnees from the Lord's Resistance Army suffer from distressing nightmares, fantasies, flashbacks, or have problems with concentration, as they say themselves. According to our empirical findings, concentration can be difficult if the person has learned to use the defense mechanism of dissociation. Thus, in some interviews, I observed that the interviewees stopped listening to me and became mentally absent. I must say I started my empirical research career more or less with a study on Holocaust survivors, and the phenomenon they described and also how they acted with it in the interview were very similar. What I'm trying to say here is that we should not assume that people from the so-called global south function according to completely different psychological mechanisms. Whether they are traumatized by violence or find themselves in situations that are prescribed by traditions, they experience feelings of sadness and hopelessness, although they had been taught not to express this feeling or talk in a different way as we researchers accepting it. And to the very end, I will come to an example to exemplify this. I have already mentioned that we normally work with field assistants from the region and grouping we are studying, and that we attach importance to discussing our interviews and observation with them. However, this can lead to a situation in which we have to go against the advice of a field assistant who is interpreting for us in the interview. For instance, they may be reluctant to translate a question which they think is politically incorrect. This was, by the way, very often in Palestine when I wanted to ask questions regarding the religion. or they think it's impolite or simple, inappropriate. Or an assistant might tell me that my question regarding a certain topic is not necessary because everyone knows this is local tradition, so you should not ask. And this I will illustrate with an example from interviews Arthur Bogner and I conducted in the northern region of Ghana on the topic of parents who give their children away to another family. I conducted some biographical interviews among the Dagomba in the northern region with the aid of a Mossi field assistant. Here it's always important to think about to which grouping the field assistant is belonging, and the Mossi are in a friendly relationship to the Dagomba. In an interview with the wife of an imam, she told me that she gave her eldest daughter to her own mother, the child's maternal grandmother, after giving birth to a second daughter. She said that this is tradition in order to help the grandmother, that she has somebody who help her. I wanted to ask her more questions about this, but refrained from doing so because my field assistant told me that if I would ask this question, the woman would only be able to say it's a normal procedure. And he told me, quote, "You are unable to understand this because you come from a different culture," unquote. This did not satisfy me. I find it hard to believe that a mother who has created a bond with her child can give the child away like that without both of them feeling distress. In a subsequent interview with the same field assistants acting as an interpreter, I insisted on asking the interviewee to tell me more, despite the objection of the field assistant. It was an interview conducted in 2013 with one of the many victims of the murdered king of the Dagomba. He was murdered in 2002. The widow told me that in 1985, when her eldest son was 3 years old, he was given to the family of another chief who lived far away from the palace, so she couldn't see him anymore. She said this is a normal tradition among chiefs, and it's in order to protect the sons from violence, especially from politically motivated assassination. Then I learned that in 1999, her younger son was also given to another chief family, but only after he had reached the age of 7. So the tradition says with 3, but he was given away with 7. During a second interview with this woman, the younger son, at this time 21 years old, was present. He had returned to live with the mother. In this interview, in which it was clear that an emotional bond has been created between the king's widow and myself, I ignored the objection of the field assistant and asked him to invite the interviewee to recall the situation when her son was given away at the age of 7. Before discussing her answer, I should point out that my field assistant clearly found this question and other questions I put extremely embarrassing. At the end of the interview, he apologized to the woman for asking this question, asked her to forgive him, and he explained to her that I couldn't know how embarrassing they were because I'm from a different culture. However, I did not see any sign that the interviewee found my questions irritating. In answer to my question about giving her son away, she gave me a detailed account of how she succeeded in persuading the king to wait until her son was 7 before sending him to live with another family that lived far away. She explained she argued with the king that the son is too shy, too sensitive, and she succeeded that he could stay. And then she told me she cried a lot at the time when the son had to go. I asked the son, who was present at the interview, what he could remember about the time he was given away. And he said firmly, quote, "I remember I did not cry. I cannot remember other things, only that," unquote. We can take it that his answers follow the rules of the local discourse with regard to his tradition, while his mother had felt free to tell me what she remembered about that time. This example shows that it's a so-called tradition that determines the rule of the discourse. In other words, how people talk about it and also how they should behave. For example, a boy should not cry when he is given away by his parents. This, by the way, I experienced myself in Uganda. I was together in a car with a boy who was given away for several hours, and he was very stiff and tried his best not to show his emotions. But this does not mean that the separation is not painful. I come to an end. I think it's very important that we not let the field assistant prevent us from asking certain questions. I mean, this we have to discuss with the field assistants, and you have to be sensitive what you can ask or what not. But in my case, I must say I had to learn to be stubborn and say, please ask and tell the people that it's my question and it's not your question. And always to take, and oh, sorry, here's something changed, not to be satisfied with explanation that invoke tradition. It's always a question, not only in the global south, also in the global north. What is the function that we get explanations with tradition? And also to take into account the rules of the dominant local discourses and the way they influence the framing of the interviews and interactions with both the interviewer and their field assistants. Let me close by remarking that I would have listing the same challenges if you had asked me to give a talk on biographical research in Germany. Thank you. What do I have to do in order to stop this?
Thank you very much, Professor Rosenthal, for your very insightful presentation. I'll be coordinating your question and answer segment of this session. This is how I propose we proceed. I will take 3 questions and comments, give you an opportunity to respond, and then proceed to the next 3 until we exhaust the time or the questions, whichever comes first.
You want me that
we already have, sorry.
I read from Bhaga Gupta. Thank you for your talk. Comment, it's important as you highlighted the geographical sense being embedded in the north-south, north-south, east-west, and other terminology, metaphors, no geographies. As I and other continues to highlight, this exists a north in the south and the south in the north. Yes, exactly. We should not homogenize and think about, I mean, this talking about in Germany about Africa. And when you are asking here, what is Africa? You have to differentiate, and also inside the country. I mean, Uganda and Ghana are countries who are very different regarding the region you are going. So it's important that we reconstruct the history of the region, the rules of the discourses in the region. And also, I mean, it's not only a question about the power imbalance between an interviewer from the West and the interviewee. It's also the question which field assistants we are working with, and also what are the different power relationships inside the country. And here, let me add something to this question. If in African countries, it's so easy to change the language. The question which language we are using in Uganda or Ghana is also a question of different power chances. Do we use the languages of the majority tribes, of the powerful tribes, or the minority tribes? So this reflexivity, it's a reflexivity between us coming from Germany or Western Europe to the so-called global south, but also the power imbalances inside these countries. I go to the chat. Yeah,
Hi, Gabriele, can I ask a question too?
Okay.
yeah, please.
I really liked also like you're not on stating about that it might be the same in the global north too, because we have also a lot of taboo topics that we're not even aware of.
Exactly.
As a lot of the audience probably know as little about, let's say, Germany than I know about, let's say, Nigeria. Could you maybe for the audience also give some examples where it might be actually a chance if a scholar from the global South comes to like a context like Germany and asks questions that we could not ask, but they could ask, like you could ask questions that they could not ask in the context you've been doing research?
I mean, first of all,
Excuse me. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the panel moderators or the keynote moderators. So what they're going to do is ask the questions that you'd have written on the chat box or through the Q&A tab to the speaker. Please await your chance to be told by the moderators to ask the question so that we can coordinate it better. Apologies for interrupting. Let's go ahead. The moderators, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. I had proposed that we'll take 3 questions at a time and give our presenter the time to respond and take three more questions until we exhaust the time or the questions. She has responded to the first question. Are there any more questions? I see a hand. Whose hand is that? I see a hand. Whose hand is that? You can raise your hand if you want to ask a question or just type on the chat box. Nina, is that your hand? Is still up? Or is Maokodi? Dr. Maokodi, do you want to make an intervention?
Maybe I should. Very, very interesting presentation. Thank you very much, Gabriele. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you mean regarding being careful around tradition, which was in your last slide. I'm saying this because from our discussion from one of our keynote speakers yesterday, Professor Gabriele talked about the significance of storytelling and understanding folklore. So I'm not quite sure how to interpret that that point you made.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it really clearly. Is the significance of what do you want me to talk to elaborate more? I didn't get it because of
let's just get a minute to organize the microphone.
Yes.
She'll ask again. The microphone was not sound.
Yes. I hope you can hear me now. Prof?
Yes, very good.
Yes. No, my question was about the last slide regarding traditional practices. I wasn't quite sure what the point was there, because also I was saying yesterday we had a talk by Professor Gabriele, who talked about the significance of understanding, indigenous knowledge systems and stories. So could you explain what you mean by traditional?
Mm-hmm. You want me to answer now? Oops.
Yes, please.
Okay, then first I come to the question by Nina, in how far it would be an advance if a scholar from the so-called global south is studying in Germany. To put it very general, what is self-evident for us, we don't realize that it's self-evident. The way we are greeting, the way we are asking questions, we don't have questions. We need a lot of effort in putting question marks to things which are self-evident. And I have a lot of staff members who are coming from other countries, for example, from Palestine and Brazil. And it's always very interesting to discuss with them or to do interviews with them together, because we are realizing different things and asking questions to things I have no idea that I should ask. And in my own experience, it was a very important experience when after the unification of Germany, I realized that in the biographical interviews in East Germany I did, we speak the same language, we are thinking we are the same. The interviews were different. For example, that the people in East Germany much more spoke about diseases and their body. And this helped me to begin to ask questions also in interviews I did in West Germany. I think if I would have time, I would come with more examples, but it's clear what you take for granted, you have no idea that you should ask about it. The question to what I understand under tradition. Here I can react in the typical manner of somebody who is coming from interpretive sociology. I don't interpret what is, or I don't define what is tradition. My point is that people are arguing with tradition, and I have to ask questions and in the analysis to find out what is the function of it, to come with the explanation, or when tradition is used as justification. And I also discussed it then with the field assistants. For example, one uncle of a returnee told me that the returnee who had to kill his parents in the time when he was in the rebel army, he is guilty, but not Josef Kony. Josef Kony is the leader of this rebel group, and not the commander who forced him to kill his parents, but because it's a tradition by the Acholi that the one who has the weapon is responsible and not the one who gave the command. So my field assistant told me he never heard of, he's also a Acholi, he never heard about this tradition. And the interesting point for me is, is it possible that I, based on the interview material, find out in which situation the relatives start to talk about the tradition and what do they want to prove with it? And in this family, it was clear they didn't want that the returnee comes on their compound. Does it help what my answer?
Yes, thank you so much for your response.
Thank you very much, Professor Rosenthal.
I want to add something. Also, when, for example, very often this explanation, they are possessed by bad spirits. If somebody in Germany tells me it's because he is traumatized, I have the same question. What is the function of this argument? And especially in Germany, there is a widespread explanation that everybody, even the Nazi killers, are traumatized. So it has an apologetic reason or function. So it's not referring to interviews in the Global South in general to ask when which kind of justification is coming.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you for the insightful presentation. It looks like we have exhausted the questions and comments. Thank you so much. One take-home point that you said about this approach is that it doesn't have any boundaries, north on South is still the same. The way people respond to questions and interviews is not, there are not many psychological differences. So it's something that can be applied across boundaries, across the North and the South divide. We have come to the end of our question and answer session. That one was just a comment. You don't need to respond to that. Thank you so much. Thank you very much to our participants. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, everybody, for attending this session. We look forward to continuing after lunch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. We are going to go for a lunch break. Please ensure you've gotten the parallel session links that you want to attend right or correct. And we'll have a closing ceremony at 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. And we are all looking forward to that, I hope. And today marks the end of our conference with the 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. Closing ceremony. All right. I'll see you guys at the parallel sessions.
Have you closed? Have you closed? Now we can say